What's up everyone? Welcome back to another video. In this video, I'll be going over what I did in the past week. So I mainly worked on the backend logic. So I'll be going over the database that I used and how I integrated with ChatGPT and some issues that I ran into. So for the database, I used SQLite 3 as my database and also the Flask SQL Alchemy as the library to create data models, and to integrate with ChatGPT, I used OpenAI API. Let's first talk about the database. So I created two tables in the database. One is called message, another one is called user, and it has a one-to-many relationship between user and message. So one user can have many messages. So within the message table, I have these columns. And as you can see, the user ID indicating which user this message is coming from. I have the row and content. Row is gonna be the value of user, assistant, system, and then content is going to be the actual either the user message or the reply from ChatGPT. And I have the created and updated timestamps. And for the user, I have the ID, the user ID, and then the username, password hash, which is going to be the hashed password so that I'm not storing the actual password in my database. And also the created at and updated at timestamp. So that's pretty much it for the database. Now let's talk about how I integrated with ChatGPT. So I'm going to show you guys a sequence diagram of how the chat endpoint works. So the UI is going to make a post request to the Flask server. And from there, the Flask server is going to get the message from the database. So we're going to retrieve messages from the database. And the database is going to return the message history back to the Flask server. And then we'll pass the message history to the ChatGPT API. And from there, the ChatGPT API is going to reply back with the response. And once we have the response, we're going to save the user message and the response from ChatGPT to the database. And also we're going to return the ChatGPT reply back to the UI as well. And that's pretty much it for the flow of the chat endpoint. Now let's take a look at the code. Okay, so I'm going to start off by looking at the database models. So this is my message model. As you can see, I am defining all the columns here. So, and also currently I don't have any input validations. I am most likely going to add that later on. And same thing with my user model. As you can see, the password hash is being hashed by this function that's provided by Flask. And this is how we create the one-to-many relationship in Flask using the Flask Alchemy library. Here's a foreign key here. Okay, now let's move on to the logic of the chat endpoint. So this is my chat endpoint, and you can see that I am getting the requested data from the UI, and then I will make a query to the database to get all the messages from the database. And then I would format the messages in the database into a list of key value pairs that contain the keyword row and content. And the reason for that is because that's what ChatGPT is looking for when you use their APIs. And once I have the formatted message history, I will pass it to this function, which is I will pass it to the function, which it will use the ChatGPT API to get a reply back. So once I get the reply back, then I will save the reply content and also the user message to the database. And this is how I save it to the database. And once I save to the database, I will return the replied content back to the UI. So as you can see for the database, so my thought was that I have a database module that basically interacts with the database. So anytime I need to do something with the database, I will call this module called database, and we can take a look at that. And the reason I did this is because I follow the Flask R project structure, and that's what they did, is that they have their own database.py file that interacts with the database. And you can see I have wrapper functions here that helps with interacting with the database. Okay, let's go over some issues that I ran into. So the first issue that I ran into is when I was creating a database. So let me just start up the SQLite 3 command line interface. Okay, yeah, so the first issue is that since I'm developing on Windows, the installation of Python doesn't include SQLite command line interface. So I had to download this command line interface separately. I used to work with Macs, and I thought that was a little strange since I believe on Linux or Mac OS, the command line interface just comes with Python. Okay, so the next error that I encountered is when I was trying to insert data into the database. So I'm going to create a table first. And as you can see, I have a table there. So once I have this table message, I am trying to insert data into the message table using an insert statement by providing the values. So let me change that real quick since this is what I had initially. And when I hit enter, I got an error message, parse error, no such column user. I didn't really understand what this meant. And it had an error message here that's pointing at this quote. But at the time, I didn't know what this meant. But turns out the reason for this error is because I had double quotes rather than single quote. And this took me a very long time to try to figure it out. So if I change everything to a single quote, then that worked. So if I do mode box and select everything from message, and you can see that message worked. So yeah, so if you are working on Windows environment, or I'm not sure if the same thing for other operating systems, but make sure when you use SQLite 3, use single quotes instead of double quotes in the command line interface. So that was the database errors that I ran into. Another thing that I want to mention right now is whenever I make changes to the model classes, I basically would I would drop my database and then recreate one by using this initdb command. So as you can see, I'm dropping everything and then create the database again. And the reason for me doing this right now is because I don't have a way to automatically migrate my databases. And I know there's a few libraries out there that you can do that. So I most likely will add that to my future process to make things easier. Yeah, that's pretty much it for this video. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.